second day of the Delphi Economic Forum and the panel on climate, race to net zero, race to resilience. I'm Christina Deligianni, I'm the Managing Director of Verimpact, and we have a panel of esteemed speakers and thought leaders with us, starting with Mr. Adam Elman, the Head of Sustainability of Google for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, the Honorable Bogolo, Kenewendo, Africa Director, UN Climate Change High-Level Champions Advisor and former Minister of Investment and Trade in Botswana. Welcome. Ms. Sara Minkara, the Special Advisor on International Disability Rights from the US Department of State, and Ms. Elisabeth Lipiatou from the European Commission, the Head of DG Communication Networks, Content and Technology. So today we will be talking about net zero and resilience. There's been a lot of talk about ESG, and especially the E pillar, that is the environment, and net zero, which is the cutting down of greenhouse gas emissions to as close as zero as possible and compensate for the remaining emissions with planting forests and creating carbon sinks. And there's also a second aspect, a second element to that, that is climate change building, adaptation to climate change effects and building resilience, climate resilience, and this is why we talk today about net zero and resilience in organizations and in countries. So starting with you, Mr. Elman, the question is, how does Google work on net zero, and what is the and what is actually the support that you give to organizations, to other organizations, and to other to SMEs regarding climate resilience, regarding innovation, and regarding foresight?
Great, thanks for the question. It's great to be here and with such a great panel of esteemed speakers. Sustainability has been a core value of Google since the business was founded. 2 years ago, we set our most ambitious goal to be net zero across our operations and value chain, so Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions by 2030. But as I say, this builds on 2 decades worth of climate action. Back in 2010, we started investing in renewable energy, and in 2017, for the first time, we were able to match 100% of our electricity usage on an annual basis with renewable energy, something we've done every year since. But, you know, for us, that's never good enough. We're always looking to do more. And whilst matching our energy use on an annual basis is a great start, it means that at times of the year in places around the world, we're still reliant on what's available in the grid. So we're now working towards what we call 24/7 carbon-free energy. What does that mean? It means sourcing carbon-free energy locally every hour of every day. So by 2030, when you're sending a Gmail or streaming a video on YouTube or using Google Maps to navigate, that will all be done by Google data centers powered by 24/7 carbon-free energy. But actually, whilst that's really important in terms of our own operations, the bigger impact we believe we can have is through our technology and partnering with others. So if I just give you 2 examples of how we're doing that. On the previous panel, we've just heard about the importance of the tourism industry here in Greece. And actually, we commissioned a survey recently which showed that 9 out of 10 hoteliers believe that sustainability is key to their future success, and there's a real need to get more skills into this space. However, only 13% of them have the knowledge they need to take action, and 2 in 5 really want support in this area. So recognizing this need, actually last year here in Delphi, we announced a new program in partnership with the Ministry of Tourism and the Global Sustainability Tourism Council to really help boost sustainable tourism in Greece through investment and through training. And I'm really pleased to say over the last year, we've helped train over 4,000 people, and we're continuing to do more. And just one other example is our work with cities. And you know, this is a really great example of how we're using AI, artificial intelligence, and other technology. Over half the global population live in cities, and cities account for around 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And they have big ambitions, but often lack the tools and the technology to take action. And so a number of years ago, we launched a freely accessible tool for cities called the Environmental Insights Explorer. It provides details on building emissions, transport emissions, the opportunity to deploy solar rooftops, for example. And through this technology, it's really enabling cities to take action. Athens is a great example. They've been using the tool to baseline transport emissions, using that to take action and monitor to see if that really is having the impact they want year on year. So just a couple of examples, there are many more there.
Great, thank you so much. Honorable Bogolo, how does the UN address net zero and building resilience?
Thank you very much for having me, and that question, I think it's really so broad. There are different aspects that I'd like to touch on. There's been a high-level expert group on net zero that was commissioned by the Secretary General and came up with recommendations in particular focused to accountability. But over and above that, from the Paris Agreement, the high-level champions where they were formed started focusing really on race to zero on non-state actors and the participation by non-state actors. And that's the area that I particularly want to focus on, recognizing that we all have an individual responsibility towards the decarbonization agenda and halving emissions by 2030 and 2050, and really rallying non-state actors into our long-term climate action goals, and recognizing that while ordinarily or typically the UNFCCC and negotiations around climate action will always run by member states, by countries, and there was a very important need to ensure that all the other players in the economy are actually active within the climate action space. So Race to Zero became one of the outcomes from the high-level climate champions, together with UNFCCC and many other partners. And while I work for the high-level champions, I think it's very key that we mention that there's been such a strong focus on a decarbonization agenda, but from the inception of the Race to Zero, there have been several items that have been highlighted as very key for us to deliver on our long-term goals, and I wanted to state these. So you've talked, Adam, about electrification. So ramping up electricity and electrification has been very key, and a lot of people have focused on this. And then second, there's been a strong focus on phasing down and out of fossil fuels, and we know that there are very strong lobby groups on this particular aspect. But the third one, which is, I think, is also as equally important, particularly as we are in the year of the global stocktake, is around protecting and restoring forests, grasslands, oceans, and water basin, and then ensuring security of global food supplies and balancing out the residual emissions with removals, and mobilizing financial flows towards developing economies, emerging markets, and investing in decarbonization, supporting adaptation resilience measures. And these last three pillars that I mentioned, I think that they are often overlooked in terms of or over a decarbonization agenda. And we cannot just focus on decarbonization agenda without thinking about adaptation and resilience. And previously, as we were heading to COP27, really, the conversation was adaptation and resilience coming off from a developing country perspective or developing world, global south perspective. But what we know now is that we all have to focus on adaptation and resilience, and the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda was adopted during COP27. While it was pushed by developing countries, it is seen as an imperative for everybody. We know that the risks of and vulnerabilities of climate action are only going to increase, and we need to ramp up investments that go into building adaptation and resilience in particular. So here we're talking about how we are protecting nature, we're talking about how we are, our built environments, how we react to those. And it's not only about the buildings, it's about how we protect the environment as we build, and similarly, how it is that we are also de-risking economies, areas of doing business as vulnerabilities in the economy increases. So issues such as insurance are also starting to take a very prominent role here. So there is quite a lot that I can talk to, but I think those are just the key aspects that I wanted to highlight as we start this conversation.
Thank you so much. It's very important to get a different perspective, especially from emerging economies, because sometimes we're very much engulfed in what the Western world is doing, and we don't see the big picture. So, Ms. Minkara, how is the State Department approaching net zero, and how is it building resilience and foresight?
First of all, it's an honor to be here with everyone. Hold on, let me just find that. Yeah, beautiful. And I just want to kind of set the stage, and some of you might already know this, but let me set the picture, and then I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about net zero and disability. So we all know that it's estimated by 2050, there will be 200 million refugees, climate refugees, okay? 200 million. What's the percentage of persons with disabilities in our population? It's around 15 to 16%. To be honest, it'll be a little bit more, especially in moments of crisis. Let's apply that number to the 200 million. That's what, 30 to 32 million individuals with disabilities that will be climate refugees, okay? That's a big number. A few years ago, there was research done around the Paris agreements. Out of 192 countries, only 35 countries had disability in their climate pledges. 35 out of 192, okay? And 45 countries in general have disability in any of their national agendas when it comes to climate action. Some people might say, well, why does it matter? Why is it important for us to really include disability, mention disability in our green climate agendas going to net zero? Well, let me explain why. We talked about here, to move towards net zero, we need to be creating sustainable solutions, green financing, transitioning to green jobs. But to be honest, when we exclude the disability perspective from this conversation, we will never be able to achieve fully net zero. There's a lot of sustainable solutions that are created that are not even taking into consideration the accessibility for persons with disability. It's estimated by 2050, around up to 70% of people will be living in urban cities, right? And as Adam mentions, you know, we need to be making sure that we're taking into consideration sustainable solutions in urban settings. But do we think about how do we make sure, as we're building bike lanes, as we're making public transportation, as we're putting all these different infrastructure to make sure it's accessible for persons with disabilities? Because when it's not, we're not going to be able to fully apply this. We're actually going to be further marginalizing persons with disabilities. When we are creating urban gardens and to make sure there's more green-friendly spaces, and if they're not accessible for persons with disabilities, again, when we are, even a simple example of, you know those straws, the paper straws that have become so popular? But have people ever considered that for a lot of people, disability is not accessible for them because the flexibility of a straw is important? Mm-hmm. Those are not even considered. We are moving towards a smart world, right? Where to be more energy efficient, smart technology helps. But again, when accessibility is not part of the conversation, it's never going to be fully achieved. Why are we left out of the conversation? Green jobs. Do people think about how to make sure as we transition to green jobs, they're accessible for persons with disabilities to tap into their skill set as well? You know, I will say whenever we take the word climate action and disability, what do people think about actually in general? Protection. Resiliency maybe at best. I want us to come to a point where we say when we're not including people with disabilities into the net zero conversation, not only are we not going to be able to achieve that agenda fully, but we're losing out on people with disabilities innovation that they can be bringing together. Because when we create a system that's accessible for persons with disability, so when we create sustainable solutions that are accessible for persons with disability, it's going to be accessible for everyone. And it's going to benefit everyone. There's a phrase in the disability world that says nothing about us without us, which is so important because, to be honest, a lot of things are created without us. I say let's take it a step further, and I say nothing without us. So my ask of you all here today, whoever's working on climate action, net zero agendas, make sure you have the disability perspective at the table. Make sure you're asking ESG, green financing, to make sure they're thinking about disability and accessibility. Make sure you're always ensuring that disability is at the table from a value-based lens. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been very inspiring, and since we have Google with us today, and you have so many tools, the accessibility and the disability aspect while building those tools is really, really important. Ms. Lipiatou, how does the European Union, the European Commission, approach net zero, and how do we build resilience for the EU member states?
Thank you. Just, if you permit me, just a few things about me. I grew up in Athens, and I spent summers through university in the Mediterranean seashore, experiencing through the last decades the changes from climate change, growing population, and tourism. I pursued oceanography, and 30 years ago I joined the European Commission to do my part in implementing sound climate policies. Here today, I speak on my personal capacity. So, how we do it in Europe? For us, as we enter this most critical decade in terms of impactful climate action, the needs for all continents and the need for international cooperation and for all of us to act responsibly will only increase. So in Europe, we have a strategy to tackle climate change and to achieve climate neutrality by 2050, the EU Green Deal. To achieve this, the European climate law calls for all EU countries to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, by 55% by 2030. So the Green Deal aims to have a cleaner environment, moving to circular economy, to smarter transport, to new jobs, to cheaper energy, and also includes issues like land use and emission reduction schemes. It is Europe's commitment to achieve the goals of Paris Agreement. Now in Europe, since the beginning of the European project, there was a very strong link between climate policies and research and innovation. Actually, there is a paper to appear in Oxford Research Encyclopedia very soon about it. And so the European Union Research and Innovation Programme, what is the biggest international program in research and innovation, had played over the last 40 years a critical role in establishing Europe's leading position on climate science and built long-lasting communities, not only in Europe but abroad, because it has international cooperation as one of its key objectives. So now it helps Europe as one of the instruments to implement the Paris Agreement. It involves society, and it has a mission, a green mission on adaptation, since we spoke about it, in which supports 150 European regions to become climate resilient by 2030. Here we are in the Eastern Mediterranean. This sea is warming 20% faster than the global average of world's oceans. And within the Mediterranean, the Eastern Med is a hot spot. This is changing the ecology, the biodiversity, the fisheries, the introduction of exotic species. We will see heat waves in cities and droughts in farming areas, including in Greece, wines and olive treasures. Climate change is causing sea level rise, which will impact coastal areas and alter the landscapes, and that in the next decades. So adaptation, and it was said before, strategies for the short and mid-term and mitigation for the long, it should be the center for the Mediterranean for a better future. And that is not a Mediterranean issue. It's a Mediterranean, a European, and a global issue, and as such needs to be addressed globally. We need to act all together using existing knowledge, green, digital, all existing instruments available in Europe and abroad. After all, we are in Delphi. This is a symbolic city considered by ancient Greeks the center of the world. So we have global issues. We need to act globally.
Thank you. So back to you, Mr. Elman. There have been a lot of firsts for Google as regards net zero and sustainability, and you mentioned some of those. Google was the very first company in history to become carbon neutral. You use a lot of renewables, and you have been also investing in renewable energy projects along the way. So since we are at Delphi, as Ms. Lipiatou said, what about an oracle from Google? What does the future hold for Google as regards net zero? And along the way, how can Google help startups, SMEs, citizens, organizations, governments to achieve net zero?
Yeah, I wish we had all the answers. I'm afraid we don't, which is why my point earlier about partnership is so key here, because it's the only way we're going to get to the scale and the pace of change that we need. But ultimately, all of these goals are about a sustainable future for all. And we have some big challenges ahead, but actually, I'm an optimist. And the IPCC have said, we have all the solutions today. We just need to deploy them. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to do at Google is partner with others to see how we can deploy these solutions. So you mentioned SMEs, so if I just talk about SMEs for a moment and our work in that space. So depending on where you are in the world, the numbers differ, but small medium enterprises make up a key part of the economy. And equally, they want to take action, but perhaps don't have access to the same resources that a company like Google has. So a couple of years ago, through Google.org, which is our philanthropic arm, we provided $1 million of funding to an organization called Normative, along with 12 Google fellows who basically spent 6 months working for free to develop a carbon calculator specifically for small, medium companies, helps them calculate their own emissions, but also their value chain, and then helps them take action. So this tool has now been used by over 2,600 SMEs in 80 countries around the world, including here in Greece. They've measured over 7 million tons. And we're continuing to see great action here. And the tool, as I say, is available for free. It sits on the UN's SME Climate Hub. So if you are an SME or you work with SMEs, I'd encourage you to look at the tool or ask others to look at it. But I think more broadly, when we think about citizens, which let's face it, that's all of us. We get to see through Google what everyone's searching for. But don't worry, you can look on Google Trends and check it out for yourself. But in 2022, we saw breakout trends on sustainability-related searches, such as, how do I save energy? How do I recycle? How do I buy an EV? Whatever the term may be. So it's clear that billions of people around the planet want to take action. And at Google, we want to help them through our tools on that journey. Many of you may have used Google Maps. Google Maps for many years has helped people travel more sustainably. We've shown you how to walk from location A to B, how to cycle, given you details around public transportation options. But one of the areas we really wanted to help people with is those that are driving. And last year in Europe, we launched what we call fuel-efficient or eco-friendly routing. Again, this uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to calculate the most fuel-efficient route, if it's not already the fastest. So it will say, for example, there's an alternative route. It may be, let's say, 2 minutes slower, but could save you 10 or 15% in fuel. And it's had a really big impact. So since we've launched this, and also in the US and Canada, it's saved around 500,000 tons of carbon. That's the equivalent of taking about 100,000 vehicles off the road. And we actually have a demo in the reception area, so by all means come and check it out. But more broadly, communities around the world are being impacted every day by climate change, whether that's increase in floods, hurricanes, wildfires. And this is an area we believe technology can help. And a couple of years ago, we launched flood forecasting to really help with this in conjunction with authorities around the world. In 2021, we sent out 115 million alerts to 23 million people, so saving countless lives. And this is using technology to really give these alerts. And as the technology improves, we've been able to increase the alerts from 48 hours up to 7 days. And we're expanding this, and as I say, we're using similar technology for wildfires and heat detection and all sorts of different areas. So a lot more to do, again, working in partnership with others. We're really excited about it, and keen to do more. And I take the earlier point around sort of disability and inclusion more broadly. I think it's an area as Google we work on heavily, but there's always more we can do.
Mm-hmm. So there are the tools, there are the technologies. We do have solutions to climate change adaptation and building resilience and racing to net zero. And of course, we will be very much excited to see what is happening at the next UN General Assembly, where there will be a discussion for the implementation of the UN 2030 Agenda, the SDGs, and of course, the next COP that will take place in the Emirates. So, Honorable Bogolo, what has been your experience so far with net zero resilience in Africa Africa? You briefly mentioned that. And what about getting younger people, the younger generation involved in net zero, in building resilience, in sustainability awareness, especially in Africa?
Right, thanks. We've actually been joking around that it appears 2023 is the year of climate conferences, because there are so many, we can't keep up. There's the US Climate Summit that just ended. There's going to be a UN Climate Summit before COP. There's the Paris Climate Summit by President Macron. There is the G20 that's going to have a Green Development Compact. There's the Kenya Climate Action Summit in September. There's the Africa Climate Week. So there's a lot of climate meetings, summits happening this year. And I think it's because, you know, the urgency is starting to build. People want to find solutions, and everyone wants to position themselves as a leader in an area that is seemingly getting really hot. No pun intended. But you know, it's certainly a very interesting year post COP27 in particular, because of conversations around loss and damage that were started, finally tabled and in the agenda for the Conference of Parties, and that the adaptation agenda has also gotten such a prominent role. And these were very important for African member states, particularly throughout the years, but specifically last year, because they felt that if a COP is being held in the continent, then the issues that are on the agenda should be reflective of the needs of the continent. And we mention a lot adaptation and resilience, because at the moment, I think we estimate the need for implementation of the NDCs to be about $2.8 trillion between now and 2030, and annually we need about $70 billion for adaptation alone. And so far, only about $26 billion makes it into the continent. And so the way we think about it, adaptation has to be, or climate action more broadly, has to be inclusive, and has to be equitable, and there has to be fairness to the delivery of even a green development pathway. And the way we've thought about that was, and this was one of our junior officers thought, you know, we need to have more young people present within the COP space. And an example that he gave is for COP26, they were in the UK, and they were squatting all over the conference. They had no place to meet as young people. I say they because I think I'm now outside the
right.
that bracket. But you know, and that in itself doesn't create a conversation or an enabling space for in-depth conversation and leadership to be provided by young people. And I think the first thing that we have to do, and that we're actively working on, and we haven't really fully served the system, is to make sure that we are creating enough space for young people in decision making, and for them to be active even in policy making. And so the inception of this youth pavilion during the COP meetings started last year, and we have it on guarantee that the UAE government will carry on the youth pavilion, and all the leaders will keep going as they did last year. The UNSG and different presidents went and engaged young people at that particular space. And throughout this year, we will be engaging young people across the continent around the IPCC report and many others about how they think we could be challenging, not only dealing with the challenges of climate action, but where are the opportunities? And the way we're changing the narrative is, instead of, we know that we are dealing with the short brunt here of the stick, but we can also be leaders in driving solutions. And that is the kind of position that we're putting a lot of young people in the continent. What are the solutions that you think we should be driving? Go back into indigenous knowledge and think about the way we can put in technology. We can modernize indigenous solutions and actually scale them up across the continent. So this has been a really exciting period, and we are thinking about exactly how we start to partner with companies like Google in the continent and help to finance those ideas and to drive innovation, particularly in agriculture, that goes beyond just the continent. So this has been really interesting. And before I pass it back to you, I think it's also worth us noting that, you know, the net zero conversation certainly has to be based on equity, fairness. We have our common shared agenda of these long-term goals, but we shouldn't forget that we are starting and currently at different areas of development and different areas of access and different areas of equity. And as we think about the solutions that we want to implement, start thinking scalability beyond the spaces that you exist in. How is it exactly that you can ensure that you're reaching beyond your borders to others, because we are not safe if, no one is safe if we are not all safe. And it's not only a moniker of COVID-19, it applies to everything. True. You know, immigration will increase if the island states are not protected and there's no adaptation and resilience. You know, if we don't have food and there's no food security, we will gravitate to places where there is food. So it's better that we all think much more broadly about a global agenda and how exactly we're going to deal with that, and in particular, finance those solutions.
True. This is so true, and it's important to have different voices, young voices, and to talk about accessibility and diversity beyond our continents and our spaces. And it's also important to ensure that this is a just and fair transition, and there's climate justice for everyone. So Ms. Minkara, we talked about what the industry does, but what about policy making? What about policy making in the US that encompasses diversity, inclusion, equity for all, and accessibility? What are the steps that are being taken at the moment? What does the future hold?
It's a really good question, and ultimately, like you said, you know, one of the main priorities for the Biden administration is diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility. And accessibility is very important. And how do we ensure that it's not lowercase, but it's capitalized? And to be honest, in many spaces, it is very lowercase. And this is something that, you know, in my role as U.S. Special Advisor on International Disability Rights, we're working on, with our colleagues, on ensuring that disability and accessibility is integrating across our different policies. But I want to go back to an earlier point. You know, a lot of times we see the global community when they're thinking about inclusion and accessibility for different communities, including the disability communities. Sometimes it's just added in without the thought process of what does that really mean? And are we really including the voices and the perspective? And how do we really ensure that, because I'm gonna always ask the question, this is a question I would like everyone to think about and actually leave this room thinking about, why is the disability community always left behind? Truly. And that's a question I'm always asking myself, because we are always left behind in a lot of these conversations. And then two, actually, my panelist's amazing comment, she said, how do we change the narrative? Similarly, on the disability community, how do we change the narrative when we talk about climate action on disability? One, yes, we need to make sure there's protection of persons with disability, but not just because we are always said, people always say, oh, people with disabilities are vulnerable. Sorry, I'm not vulnerable because I'm blind. I am vulnerable because the system is not accessible. Right. There's a distinction. So we need to make sure systems are accessible, to make sure when we respond to crisis that persons with disabilities are able to receive the same level of support like anyone else. But then let's take it a step further, and let's say when we bring people with disabilities to the table, we're gonna benefit. And that's what we are trying to do in the Biden administration, is amplify the disability voice and perspective from a point of value. It will benefit everyone. And that is something that we are continuing to doing across, with partnerships, right? We need to make sure we're partnering up with the civil society organization, international organization, the corporate sector, every single sector. So that is my ask, is continue thinking about bringing in the disability from a value-based perspective.
Thank you. And Ms. Lipiatou, as we have less than 3 minutes, just a final comment. What about the EU, the Commission and policy making? There's so many flagship programs, the Just Transition Initiative, the EU Green Deal, the Mission Ocean, the Net Zero Cities Mission, the EU Climate Pact. I'm an ambassador in that program. So there's so many flagship programs. What about geopolitical developments that are happening in our neighborhood, and what does that mean for EU policy making and achieving net zero? Very quickly.
Okay. I spoke before about the European Green Deal, that is the EU policy to achieving these climate targets, and I think to an extent it's also addressing some of the implications of the present geopolitical situation in both, short-term and long-term. So on the energy front, the EU proposed last May to launch a repower plan and to help member states to take measures to help households and business. And this year, just this month, actually, the European Parliament had adopted 3 key laws in this general context to reform the emission trading scheme, a new social climate fund to combat energy and mobility poverty, and also a new carbon leakage instrument to protect the EU industry and increase global climate ambition. So there are new things ongoing. And as I said before, the EU climate policies are linked to research and innovation, and there is the biggest program we have now is Horizon. You mentioned it has 97 billion euros, and from this, 35% has to contribute to EU climate objective, and 1 billion to climate science and solutions. So it helps also, it helps the Union to implement the Paris Agreement. It shows also that it could flexibly adapt to new requirements. So I think looking ahead, we have to address critical issues. We have to look to the nexus of water, energy, climate, to use new technologies and artificial intelligence, and to also have stronger interactions between scientists and non-scientists. We already spoke about, okay. So I think at the end,
I'm so
we can
sorry.
work only with international cooperation, and we should act together, and on this, yes, also science diplomacy could play a role.
Thank you so much. It's been a very engaging discussion with all speakers. Thank you so much for being with us, for flying from the US, from Botswana, from London. So, well, it's far away.
Not as impressive, sorry.
It is. And thank you for the audience. Thank you for being with us. And hopefully we'll be meeting next year here as well. Thank you.